Hi everyone, I'm Vappu and I'm reading from Finland, from my hometown called Kerava. And I'll be reading chapter 25 from Jane of Lantern Hill. Little Aunt Em had sent word to Lantern Hill that Jane Stewart was to come and see her. "You must go," said Dad. "Little Aunt Em's invitations are like those of royalty in this neck of the woods." "Who is Little Aunt Em?" "Blessed if I know exactly. She's either Mrs. Bob Barker or Mrs. Jim Gregory. I never can remember which of them was her last husband. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Everybody calls her Little Aunt Em. She's about as high as my knee, and so thin she once blew over the harbor and back. But she's a wise old goblin. She lives on that little side road you were asking about the other day, and does weaving and spinning and dyeing rug rags. Dyes them in the good old-fashioned way with herbs and barks and lichens. What Little Aunt Em doesn't know about the colors you can get that way isn't worth knowing. They never fade. Better go this evening, Jane. I've got to get the third canto of my Methuselah epic done this evening. I've only got the young chap along as far as his first 300 years. At first, Jane had believed with a touching faith in that epic of Methuselah, but now it was just a standing joke at Lantern Hill. When Dad said he must knock off another canto, Jane knew he had to write some profound treatise for Saturday evening and must not be disturbed. He did not mind having her around when he wrote poetry, love lyrics, idylls, golden sonnets, but poetry did not pay very well, and Saturday evening did. Jane set out after supper for Little Aunt Em's. The Snowbeams, who had already missed one excitement that afternoon, wanted to go with her in a body, but Jane refused their company. Then they were all mad, and, with the exception of Shingle, who decided it wasn't ladylike to push yourself in where you weren't wanted and went home to Hungry Cove, persisted in accompanying Jane for quite a distance, walking close to the fence in exaggerated awe and calling out taunts as she marched disdainfully down the middle of the road. "Ain't it a pity her ears stick out?" said Penny. Jane knew her ears didn't stick out, so this didn't worry her. But the next thing did. "Supposin' you meet a crocodile on the side road," called Caraway. "That'd be worse than a cow." Jane winced. How in the world did the Snowbeams know she was afraid of cows? She thought she had hidden that very cleverly. The Snowbeams had got their tongues loosened up now and peppered Jane with a perfect barrage of insults. "Did you ever see such a high and lofty, stuck-up minx? Proud as a cat driving a buggy, ain't you? Too grand for the likes of us. I always said you'd a proud mouth. Do you think Little Aunt Em will give you any lunch?" "If she does, I know what it will be," yelled Penny. "Raspberry vinegar and 2 cookies and a sliver of cheese. Yah, who'd eat that? Yah." "I'll bet you're afraid of the dark." Jane, who was not in the least afraid of the dark, still preserved a withering silence. "You're a foreigner," said Penny. Nothing else they had said mattered. Jane knew her Snowbeams, but this infuriated her. She, a foreigner, in her own darling island where she had been born. She stopped short at Penny. "Just you wait," she said with a concentrated venom, "till the next time any of you want to scrape a bowl." The Snowbeams all stopped short. They had not thought of this. Better not rile Jane Stewart anymore. We didn't mean to hurt your feelings, honest," protested Caraway. They promptly started homeward, but the irrepressible young John yelled, "Goodbye, collarbones," as he turned. Jane, after she had shrugged off the Snowbeams, had a good time with herself on that walk. That she could go where she liked over the countryside, unhindered, uncriticized, was one of the most delightful things about her life at Lantern Hill. She was glad of an excuse to explore the side road where little Aunt Em lived. She had often wondered where it went to. That timid little red road, laced with firs and spruces that tried to hide itself by twisting and turning. The air was full of the scent of sun-warmed grasses gone to seed. The trees talked all about her in some lost sweet language of elder days. Rabbits hopped out of the ferns and into them. In a little hollow she saw a faded sign by the side of the road. Straggling black letters on a white board, put up years agone by an old man, long since dead. "Ho, everyone that thirsteth, come ye to the waters." Jane followed the pointing finger down a fairy path between the trees and found a deep, clear spring, rimmed in by mossy stones. She stooped and drank, cupping the water in her brown palm. A squirrel was impudent to her from an old beech, and Jane sassed him back. She would have liked to linger there, but the western sky above the treetops was already filled with golden rays, and she must hasten. When she passed up out of the brook hollow, she saw little Aunt Em's house curled up like a cat on the hillside. A long lane led up to it, edged with clumps of white and gold, life everlasting. When Jane reached the house, she found little Aunt Em spinning on a little wheel set before her kitchen door, with a fascinating pile of silvery wool rolls lying on the bench beside her. She stood up when Jane opened the gate. She was really a little higher than Dad's knee, but she was not so tall as Jane. She wore an old felt hat that had belonged to one of her husbands on her rough, curly grey head, and her little black eyes twinkled in a friendly fashion in spite of her blunt question. "Who are you?" "I'm Jane Stewart." "I knew it," said Aunt Em in a tone of triumph. "I knew it the minute I saw you walking up the lane. You can always tell a Stewart anywhere you see him by his walk." Jane had her own way of walking, quickly but not jerkily, lightly but firmly. The Snowbeam said she strutted, but Jane did not strut. She felt very glad that little Aunt Em thought she walked like the Stewarts, and she liked little Aunt Em at first sight. "You might come and sit down a spell if you a mind to," said little Aunt Em, offering a wrinkled brown hand. "I've finished this lick of work I was doing for Mrs. Big Donald. I'm not up to much now, but I was a smart woman in my day, Jane Stewart." Not a floor in Aunt Em's house was level. Each one sloped in a different direction. It was not notoriously tidy, but there was a certain hominess about it that Jane liked. The old chair she sat down in was a friend. "Now we can have a talk," said little Aunt Em. "I'm in the humor for it today. When I'm not, nobody can get a word out of me. Let me get my knitting. I neither tat, sew, embroider, nor crochet, but the Hull Maritimes can't beat me knitting. I've been wanting to see you for some time. Everybody's talking about you. I'm hearing you're smart. Mrs. Big Donald says you can cook like a blue streak. Where did you learn it?" "Oh, I guess I've always known how," said Jane airily. Not under torture would she have revealed to little Aunt Em that she had never done any cooking before she came to the island. That might reflect on Mother. "I didn't know you and your dad was at Lantern Hill till Mrs. Big Donald told me last week at Mary Ho's funeral. I don't get anywhere much now except to funerals. I always make out to get to them. You see everybody and hear all the news. Soon as Mrs. Big Donald told me, I made up my mind I'd see you. What thick hair you've got! And what nice little ears! You have a mole on your neck. That's money by the peck. You don't look like your ma, Jane Stewart. I knew her well. Jane's spine felt tickly. Oh, did you? Breathlessly. I did. They lived in a house at the harbour head, and I was living there too, on a bit of a farm beyond the Barrens. It was just after I'd married my second. Worse luck. The way the men get round you. I used to take butter next to your ma, and I was in the house the night you were born. A wonderful fine night it was. How is your ma? Pretty and silly as ever? Jane tried to resent Mother being called silly, but couldn't manage it. Somehow you couldn't resent anything little Aunt Em said. She twinkled at you so. Jane suddenly felt that she could talk to little Aunt Em about Mother, ask her things she had never been able to ask anyone. Mother is well. Oh, Aunt Em, can you tell me? I must find out. Why didn't Father and Mother go on living together? Now you're asking, Jane Stewart. Aunt Em scratched her head with a knitting needle. Nobody ever knew rightly. Everyone had a different guess. Did they really love each other to begin with, Aunt Em? They did. Make no mistake about that, Jane Stewart. They hadn't a lick of sense between them, but they were crazy about each other. Will you have an apple? And why didn't it last? Was it me? They didn't want me. Who said so? I know your ma was wild with joy when you was born. Wasn't I there? And I always thought your pa uncommon fond of you, though he had his own way of showing it. Then why? Lots of people thought your grandmother Kennedy was at the bottom of it. She was dead against them marrying, you know. They were staying at the big hotel on the South Shore that summer after the war. Your dad was just home. It was love at first sight with him. I dunno's I blamed him. Your ma was the prettiest thing I ever did see. Like a little gold butterfly she was. That little head of hers shorter shone like. Oh, didn't Jane know it? She was seeing that wonderful knot of pale luminous gold at the nape of Mother's white neck. And her laugh. It was a little tinkling, sparkling, young laugh. Does she laugh like that yet, Jane Stewart? Jane didn't know what to say. Mother laughed a great deal. Very tinkly, very sparkly. But was it young? Mother laughs a great deal. A good deal, she said carefully. She was spoiled, of course. She'd always had everything she wanted. And when she wanted your pa, well, she had to have him too. For the first time in her life, I'm guessing, she wanted something that her mother wouldn't get to her. The old madam was dead against it. Your ma couldn't stand up to her, but she ran away with your pa. Old Mrs. Kennedy went back to Toronto in a towering rage. But she kept writing to your ma and sending her presents and coaxing her to go for visits. Your pa's folks weren't any more in favor of the match than your ma's. He could have had any island girl he liked. One in particular, Lillian Morrow. She was yaller and spindling then, but she's grown into a handsome woman. Never married. Your Aunt Irene favored her. I've always said it was that two-faced Irene made more trouble than your grandmother. She's poison, that woman. Just sweet poison. Even when she was a girl, she could say the most poisonous things in the sweetest way. But she had your pa roped and tied. She'd always petted and pampered him. Men are like that, Jane Stewart. Every one of them, clever or stupid. He thought Irene was perfection, and he'd never believed she was a mischief maker. Your pa and ma had their ups and downs, of course, but it was Irene put the sting into them, wagging that smooth tongue of hers. She's only a child, Drew, when your dad was wanting to believe he'd married a woman, not a child. You're so young, lovey, when your ma was feeling scared she'd never be old and wise enough for your pa. And patronizing her. She'd patronize God, that one, running her house for her, not that your ma knew much about it. That was one of her troubles, I guess. She'd never been taught how to manage or connive. But a woman don't like another woman sailing in, putting things to rights. I'd have sent her off with a flea in her ear. But your ma had darn too little spunk. She couldn't stand up to Irene. Of course Mother couldn't stand up to Aunt Irene. Mother couldn't stand up to anyone. Jane bit deep into a juicy apple rather savagely. I wonder, she said, as if more to herself than to little Aunt Em, if father and mother would have been happier if they had married other people. No, they wouldn't, said Aunt Em sharply. They was meant for each other, whatever spoiled it. Don't you go thinking different, Jane Stewart. Course they fought. Who don't? The times I've had with my first and second. If they'd been let alone, they'd likely have worked it out, sooner or later. At the last, when you was rising 3, your ma went to Toronto to visit the old madam, and never came back. That's all anybody knows about it, Jane Stewart. Your pa sold the house and went for a trip round the world. Leastwise, that's what they said, but I ain't believing the world is round. If it was, when it turned round, all the water would fall out of the pond, wouldn't it? Now I'm going to get you a bite to eat. I've got some cold ham and pickled beets, and there's red currants in the garden. They ate the ham and beets, and then went out to the garden for the currants. The garden was an untidy little place, sloping to the south, which somehow contrived to be pleasant. There was honeysuckle over the paling, to bring the hummingbirds, said little Aunt Em, and white and red hollyhocks against the dark green of a fir coppice, and rampant tiger lilies along the walk. And one corner was rich in pinks. Nice out here, ain't it? Said little Aunt Em. It's a fine, marvelous world. Oh, it's a very fine, marvelous world. Don't you like life, Jane Stewart? Yes, agreed Jane heartily. I do. I smack my lips over life. I'd like to go on living forever and hearing the news. Always a tang to the news. Some of these days I'm going to scrape up enough spunk to go in a car. I've never done it yet, but I will. Mrs. Big Donald says it's the dream of her life to go up in an aeroplane, but I draw the line at sky-hooting. What if the engine stopped going while you was up there? How are you going to get down? Well, I'm glad you come, Jane Stewart. We're both wove out of the same yarn. Little Aunt Em gave Jane a bunch of pansies and a handful of geranium slips when she went away. It's the right time of the moon to plant them, she said. Goodbye, Jane Stewart. May you never drink out of an empty cup. Jane walked home slowly, thinking over several things. She loved being out alone at night. She liked the great white clouds that occasionally sailed over the stars. She felt, as she always felt when alone with the night, that she shared some lovely secret with the darkness. Then the moon rose, a great honey-hued moon. The fields all about were touched with her light. The grove of pointed firs on an eastern hill was like a magic town of slender steeples. Jane tripped along gaily, singing to herself while her black shadow ran before her on the moonlit road. And then, just around a turn, she saw cows before her. One of them, a big black one with a strange white face, was standing squarely in the middle of the road. Jane came out in goose flesh. She could not try to pass those cows. She could not. The only thing to do was to execute a flanking movement by climbing the fence into Big Donald's pasture and going through it until she was past the cows. Ingloriously, Jane did so. But halfway along the field, she suddenly stopped. How can I blame Mother for not standing up to Grandmother when I can't stand up to a few cows, she thought. She turned and went back. She climbed the fence into the road. The cows were still there. The white-faced one had not moved. Jane set her teeth and walked on with steady, gallant eyes. The cow did not budge. Jane went past it, head in air. When she was beyond the last cow, she turned and looked back. Not a cow of them had paid her the slightest attention. "To think I was afraid of you," said Jane contemptuously. And there was Lantern Hill and the silver laughter of the harbour underneath the moon. Jimmy John's little red heifer was in the yard, and Jane drove it out fearlessly. Dad was scribbling furiously when she peeped into the study. Ordinarily, Jane would not have interrupted him, but she remembered that there was something she ought to tell him. "Dad, I forgot to tell you the house caught fire this afternoon." Dad dropped his pen and stared at her. "Caught fire?" "Yes, from a spark that fell on the roof. But I went up with a pail of water and put it out. It only burned a little hole. Uncle Tombstone will soon fix it. The snowbeams were awful mad they missed it." Dad shook his head helplessly. "What a Jane," he said. Jane, having discharged her conscience and being hungry again after her walk, made a meal off the cold fried trout and went to bed.